400 years. For 4 grueling centuries, there was a place on this earth where heaven and earth truly became one. Imagine standing on the peak of Mount Moriah, taking a deep breath to catch the pure scent of cedarwood brought from the misty forests of Lebanon, intertwining with the thick smoke of incense rising into the air. Before your eyes is not just an architectural marvel, but the beating heart of an entire nation, Solomon's Temple. Under the blinding sun of the Near East, the gold-plated walls shone so brilliantly they could blind anyone who dared to look directly at them. Everything here exuded greatness, from the shafts of light piercing through every window to the solemn melodies of stringed instruments and the echoes of sacred hymns filling the vaulted ceilings, creating an endless symphony of praise to the Almighty. When in its deepest sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, resided the divine presence. 4 centuries of murmured prayers, 4 centuries of sacrificial blood spilled, all to maintain the fragile thread connecting humanity to the Creator. But then, on a blazing summer day in 586 BC, the torches of the Babylonian army were raised. The music of worship shattered, replaced by the deafening clash of swords and the roar of collapsing stone. In a mere 4 days, the most sacred symbol, the greatest treasure of mankind, was reduced to a desolate mountain of ash. Thousands of years of hope were burned away. Yet behind that terrifying collapse, behind the thick black ash whipped up by the desert wind, lies an epic tale of arrogance, betrayal, and a chilling mystery that dry history books often keep hidden. Why did God allow His own house to burn? Why did He stand by in silence? To understand the tragedy of 586 BC, we must turn back the clock and walk the noisy streets of Jerusalem to see the seeds of destruction that had long taken root. The people of Judah were living in a delusional dream, a lie wrapped in velvet. They had woven a dangerous spiritual spell. They believed that as long as the temple stood tall, God would never let them fall. That colossal building had become a shield for all their sins. The prophet Jeremiah, a solitary man with eyes heavy with sorrow, stood in the temple courtyards, listening to the crowds chanting like sleepwalkers. The temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. They repeated it over and over, thinking the echoing sound could turn a lie into truth. They had forgotten the heart of the Almighty. They confused His residence with His approval. The temple of gold and stone was still there, so they were certain God was still smiling. They turned a blind eye to the blood of the innocent spilling on the streets, ignored the dark, pagan idols secretly erected right within the sacred corridors. Injustice ran rampant, but they believed the smoke of incense would obscure it all. God was patient. He sent messengers time and time again, carrying blood-stained warnings, but the crowd only laughed. They stoned the prophets, gagged those who spoke the truth, until the sky fell and there was no remedy left to save them. When heaven's patience finally ran out, the whip of judgment was handed to someone no one expected. Nebuchadnezzar II was no ordinary king. He was the most powerful emperor of the ancient world, the man who ordered the construction of the legendary Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the commander-in-chief of an unrivaled war machine that had crushed every nation in its path. A man who worshipped the pagan god Marduk. Yet, in a twist of fate, God called this brutal emperor my servant. In the grand tapestry of history, even the mightiest empires are but pawns in the hands of the Most High. Babylon was chosen as the sword of purification. Facing that colossal war machine was Zedekiah, the last king of Judah. A weak man placed on the throne at the age of 21, Zedekiah was a living tragedy. He was a man who always knew the righteous path, but whose legs trembled too much to walk it. Night after night, in the flickering candlelight of his palace, he would secretly summon the prophet Jeremiah to beg for a word from God. One he would listen to the truth with tears in his eyes, but the very next morning, standing before his court of blindly ambitious officials, he would shrink back and swallow the truth whole. Nebuchadnezzar had forced Zedekiah to swear an oath of loyalty, a harsh vow made in the name of the God of Israel himself. But in 589 BC, Zedekiah made a decision that would strip the life from an entire nation. He tore up the treaty. He secretly sent envoys across the scorching desert to beg the Egyptian army for rescue. A double betrayal. He stabbed the Babylonian emperor in the back, and he broke a sacred oath made in the name of the Creator. From his distant exile, the prophet Ezekiel delivered a chilling verdict. Can he break the covenant and yet escape? The answer was no. The countdown to Jerusalem's doom had begun. January 588 BC. The northern horizon of Jerusalem suddenly went dark. It wasn't a storm cloud, but a blinding hurricane of dust churning up from the marching feet of tens of thousands of besiegers. Nebuchadnezzar had brought the full might of his empire. Nearly 100,000 soldiers in gleaming armor completely surrounded a city protected by a mere 10,000 men. They didn't rush to attack. The Babylonian war machine operated with terrifying ruthlessness and patience. They dug trenches, built watchtowers, and blockaded every road. Not even a fly could slip through. The shadow of despair began to fall, and then 18 months of a living hell began. Meals went from overflowing trays of wheat to a handful of dry grains, then dwindled to a few drops of murky, salty water. There was a fleeting moment of hope when news arrived that the Egyptian army was marching up from the south. The Babylonians had to withdraw to engage them. The entire city of Jerusalem erupted in frantic joy. They danced in the ruined streets, embracing the false prophets, the liars who had lulled them to sleep with promises of peace. Only Jeremiah stood quietly, his sorrowful eyes seeing straight through to the future. "Do not deceive yourselves," he told the king. "The Egyptian army will turn back, and the Babylonians will return to burn this place to the ground." His reward for that brutal truth was the shackles. They threw the only man who wanted to save them into a pitch-black dungeon. Weeks later, the Babylonians did indeed return. The Egyptians had cowardly retreated without firing a single arrow. The web was spun tight once again. No one was coming to save them anymore. Famine began to carve deep into the bones of the trapped. Flesh clung to dry skeletons, as pale as ash. Ghostly figures wandered the streets, unrecognizable to one another. The Book of Lamentations records images so horrific they haunt the mind. A swift death by the sword on the battlefield suddenly became a luxurious release, while the slow death of starvation was fate's most cruel torture. And amidst that absolute despair, the most unimaginable tragedy occurred. Mothers, driven mad by the tearing hunger, cooked their own precious children. The ancient curse Moses had warned of thousands of years ago now materialized into a visceral reality. Not because God was cruel, but because when humanity turns its back on the source of life, they are left to face the abyss of ultimate savagery. But there is a truth that few know. When Nebuchadnezzar's flames touched the walls of the temple, God was not there to suffer defeat. He had left long ago. In a magnificent cinematic vision, Ezekiel saw the glory of the Lord, the radiant cloud carrying the thunder, lightning, and light that had once filled the temple on its dedication day, now slowly lifting from the wings of the cherubim. It hovered at the threshold, hesitating like a heartbroken father unable to bear leaving a wayward child, before quietly drifting toward the east gate, crossing the Mount of Olives and vanishing into the ether. Why did he leave? Because right inside that very house, the elders were bowing to hideous carvings of beasts on the stone walls. The Almighty would never lower himself to be a lucky charm for men with desolate hearts. The temple was now nothing more than an empty shell. In July 586 BC, after more than 500 days of groaning, the northern wall finally crumbled. Babylonian soldiers poured in like a black waterfall, crushing all life in their path. In the moment the city drowned in a sea of fire and blood, the cowardly King Zedekiah secretly fled through a hidden tunnel under the cover of night. But humiliation would not let him go. The Babylonian cavalry caught up with him and captured him on the plains of Jericho. Ironically, the exact place where, centuries ago, his people had won their first resounding victory to enter the Promised Land. Now he was dragged before Nebuchadnezzar. There, forced to his knees, he helplessly watched his sons be brutally beheaded one by one. The moment the final drops of his bloodline's blood burned into his retinas, Zedekiah's eyes were gouged out. He was thrown into a dungeon in Babylon, blind and carrying that living nightmare until his final breath. After the massacre, the chief executioner Nebuzaradan entered Jerusalem. He no longer swung a sword to kill. Instead, he carried the cold ledger of the Grim Reaper. Every order was executed: burn. The royal palace, the bustling districts, and the grand gold-plated temple, all drowned in an ocean of fire. Gold melted, streaming down the jagged stone steps like the fiery, burning tears of history. Babylonian soldiers meticulously smashed the two massive bronze pillars, inventoried every silver bowl, every golden spoon, and even counted the hundreds of bronze pomegranates decorating the pillar capitals. That chilling attention to detail proved they wanted to completely erase every trace of the past's glory. The entire treasury was loaded onto carts and dragged all the way to the Temple of Marduk in Babylon, a direct mockery of Yahweh's perceived weakness. But, amidst the tens of thousands of items listed with such cruel detail, there was an absence that shook history. The Ark of the Covenant. The most sacred chest, the very throne of God, had vanished without a trace. It was absent from the plunder lists. It was not burned, and it never appeared in the temple of the enemy. Some say the prophet Jeremiah managed to hide it in a secret cave. Others believe it was taken up to heaven. The silence of the scriptures envelops that treasure, leaving behind an eternal mystery. Finally, amidst the thick black ash, the Most High still kept a seed of hope. He did not protect the lifeless stone walls. He protected his people. Even in exile, choking back tears by the rivers of Babylon, they carried their faith. 50 years later, the proud Babylonian Empire collapsed in a single night, and the Jewish people were allowed to return to their homeland, bringing back all the golden bowls and silver vessels of old. The second temple was built, only to eventually fall again. Through all the tragedies and triumphs, one truth rings clear. The true house of God was never made of gold-plated stones or fragrant cedar wood. His home has always resided in the hearts of the faithful, a symphony that requires no earthly instruments, echoing forever in the human soul.